Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius, the man out of time, my conquistador, if you will.
I am your conquistador, my lady. How are you doing?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. I'm not too bad at all. I'm not sure how I'm going to explain this one today.
Well, let's do it. We can do it.
We can. I'm not. Right, let me put it this way. I can't explain the last 10 minutes of this film. We are talking about The Fountain, the Darren Aronofsky, The Fountain from, I think, a year, actually. What year is it? 2009?
2006.
2006. It is, you're right. 2006. Starring Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz, predominantly. Before we get into a plot, because we'll talk our way through it, Julian, what were your first impressions? And when did you first see this film? Is this your first viewing, or?
No, I saw it in theaters, and I'll talk about my reaction to it later on. But I have seen it several times subsequently, and then sort of watching it again for this podcast. I guess it had been maybe a year, 2 years, something since I saw it. And I thought, I've got to. This is some heavy stuff. I'm gonna have to trudge through, And as soon as it starts, I'm on a roller coaster ride through the whole thing. So, what about you? This was your first time. This
is my first time. Yeah, and visually, this film is stunning. Like, there's some really cool stuff in there, and I liked that how each of the narratives, there are things that keep cropping up, especially this idea of the tree, representations of nature in the background and things, especially carved in wood. There's little bits and pieces, and I thought, there's lots of thought being gone into the set design and the costuming and all this stuff that tells me exactly what's going on. Which I loved. Like, there was some really cool stuff, and the cast are pretty good. I always, I think Hugh Jackman usually pretty much brings his A game, whether it's whether it's right or not. And Rachel Weisz is beautiful, stunning, and actually very, she's a great actress. What I would say is, I'd say I liked 90% of this film. And then I was a bit like, oh, look at this waffly bollocks. This is just gone off on one. It was fine. It was good, but we'll get into it, I think.
Okay, yeah, I'm interested to hear that. Well, let's do a plot summary for the listeners.
Yes. So I haven't written one, but we are going to go through this. So Thomas Creo is a doctor experimenting in different forms of brain surgery. He is doing this predominantly because his wife, Izzy Creo, has a tumor and is getting closer and closer to death, and has symptoms such as lack of sensory for hot and cold, or taste, I think, at one point. And so he works feverishly to find a cure, and in doing so uses an element of a tree that exists in the deep forest, and it finds that whilst experimenting on an ape, it can rejuvenate brain activity and rejuvenate synapse activity, rejuvenating the ape to a much earlier age. However, it doesn't prevent the growth of the tumor. In another time, a conquistador is searching through a South American jungle looking for a mythic tree of life. and slowly his people are killed off. And he is looking to find the tree for the Queen Elizabeth. The conquistador is Tomas, and he is has been
Isabella, right? It's
sorry, Isabella. Sorry, yeah, Isabella.
Your British bias is showing.
Yeah, Isabella. She has sent him on this mission, and let's be clear, I was surprised at this point because nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. But the reason she has sent him is to get this thing.
The Inquisition. Yeah. What a show.
I'm not gonna lie, Monty Python did jump into my brain, but we will get to that. So yeah, but in the far future, some thousands of years into the future, or hundreds of years in the future, another version of Thomas, or it is actually Thomas, is traveling through space in a bubble, and is accompanied by a tree that may or may not be this tree of life, and he is heading towards the Shambhala Nebula, which is a dying nebula. And when it dies out, it will reignite and create a sun, and this idea of creating life from death, and thus sort of reigniting and bringing people back to life. All of these are connected. These three narratives are connected. In the past, I'm going to ask you if it actually exists, if it actually happened. But this conquistador may have happened in the past. It may also just be a narrative that Izzy is creating for her manuscript, The Fountain. And it is revealed that it is actually Tommy, and he has found a way to stall aging and has lived for thousands of years. And the tree is a tree that was grown from the body of Izzy when she died, and he is taken into the Shambhala Nebula to be reborn.
Right, or maybe it's the tree of life that they got the shavings from, to get that compound that is curing the chimpanzee.
Yeah.
And essentially the three narratives end with the conquistador finds the tree of life, but ingesting it causes life to sprout within him, and he collapses and dies and is food for these sprouting sort of flowers. And in the present, Izzy dies, and Tom rails against it and vows to cure death, and that's the last you see him. And in the future narrative, the nebula, the sun that's going supernova at the heart of the nebula explodes, and he and the tree are consumed, and he seems to believe that this will lead to new life, to being reborn. And he sees Izzy on that weird spherical spaceship that has the tree inside this sphere. And that's the movie.
Yeah, I mean, the thing we should know is when the thing does go supernova, it vaporizes him, but it shoots energy through him, and at the same moment, the tree is reborn because the tree's actually died and regrows. So you do see this idea of growth. Yeah, we'll get into it because there's some. I need some help with that ending, if I'm honest.
I will help you. I've thought way too much about this movie.
Yeah. What I will say is that the film opens with the conquistador, and again, this is a sort of a split narrative. It's also sort of not told consecutively. It's told in fits and spurts at times. This film takes some brain power to keep on board of what's going on in what order and why. But it starts with the conquistador and a small army, and they've sort of reached their sort of destination, and they are fighting some Aztec or Inca sort of warriors.
Mayan
warriors, yeah. And then eventually it comes down to a sword fight between Tomas and the chief,
which Tomas loses.
Yes.
And at that point in the narrative, you have seen the other narratives, and Tomas, the Mayan warrior, sees the transfigured Tomas from the future in his lotus position, and seems to have a vision of him and recognizes him as the first father, the sort of, Mayan version in this film of sort of Adam,
Yeah.
And recognizing him invites Tomas to slit his throat and continue to the Tree of Life.
Well, let's go back because we are discussing the ending, but let's go back to the sort of like these three narratives, because the characters from each are all played by Hugh Jackman and Rachel Weisz. They are sort of playing those as we used to say in the wrestling circuit, doing double duty. They're pulling a couple of different roles. Let's talk about the Conquistador and Isabella to begin with. And so, because I really enjoy this historic element because it looks great. It's one of those sort of, this is a science fiction film, no doubt, but with the costuming and some of the bits, like I like it when they have that sort of elaboration that almost gives it like a fantasy element. It helps to accept some of the magic. And so I love the way this has been shot and the way sort of the costuming and everything has been done. Like the modern day is the modern day. Like it's kept as relatively straight. But that Conquistador and Queen Isabella. Right. Question one. Let's start. So basically, he is sent because there's this a father, a Catholic priest, has been told of this tree in the middle of this jungle, South American jungle, New Spain, what they call it. And he basically the Inquisition have also heard of it. So basically, it's a bit of a race as to who gets there first. Now there isn't an actual race, there isn't an Inquisition going after it either. But they're like, you've got to get this first and claim it for Spain under the royalty, so the Inquisition don't claim it for themselves at some later point.
In theory, although the Grand Inquisitor is, I mean, this is totally ahistorical, but
yeah,
the idea is that because of this discovery, he feels as if Isabella has turned away from God and is concerned with life on this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this great speech about, the body is a prison, right? This Christian doctrine, which is quite correct for Christianity. And so to him, Isabella is a heretic, essentially.
Yes.
And he's going to overthrow Queen. Now, all of this is totally ahistorical.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
it's true that the Spanish did search for the Tree of Life. I mean, they did believe that the New World was Eden. And in fact, that goes back to Columbus in his records.
Back even further, doesn't it? Like you say, there's initial. They were looking for all kinds of things in New Spain, like say Fountain of Youth, Tree of Life, El Dorado.
They searched for it in Africa.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this obsession with finding the historical Eden, right? Because they believed that the Bible was literally true and Eden was somewhere on the planet. But obviously they didn't find it. Obviously, I mean, and it does play into this sort of like lost Mayan city trope, right? And the sort of Tree of Life trope. But there's a lot that is fictionalized. And I think the first time I saw it, I was bothered by that. But I'm not anymore.
Well, okay. And this comes to one of my questions. Because you say it's a fictionalized history, and it is. It's a complete sort of fabrication. It's almost like a fantasy. It made me think of Indiana Jones. The sort of the traps coming up and finding something healing, like Last Crusade sort of thing. However, we also find that Izzy in the present, or in the 2009 present at least, 2006 present, sorry, is writing a manuscript, and she's writing it by hand, and it's called The Fountain. Now, it's called The Fountain, which is interesting because this thing is nothing about a fountain. It's about a tree. But this whole story this story in the past is what she has written. And so my question really is, at least in the sort of, let's say in the historic context of this film, so in the universe of this film, did the Conquistadors' journey actually happen?
No.
Are they is that Isabella and Tomas a reincarnation into Thomas, or is it just everything that's in that story is a fiction?
So I'm gonna break the whole movie down for you.
No, go for it.
Because there's no way to do this without unraveling the whole thing. So yeah, I think when you first see it, you're sort of like, you don't know if they've been reincarnated or how these all relate. It is very clear that, I mean, she goes to a Mayan exhibit at a museum. She's written the fountain. What she's written is clearly what's been presented to you, and she says that all that's left is the last chapter. And there's sort of this refrain through the whole movie of where she says, "Finish it," to him.
Yes.
And she's going to die without writing the last chapter. And her husband, who is fighting to save her, is attached to Control, is focused on keeping her alive, and she's ready to go. So none of that in the past. All of the ways in which it's fictionalized, it's not really true to the Mayans. It's not really true to Spain. The actual Ferdinand and Isabella. Where's Ferdinand, right? The actual Ferdinand and Isabella were horrible people who massacred the Muslims and kicked the Jews out of the country. And, all of this is fiction. That is the fountain. And when you see the title card of the film, it's the title card of her.
Yes.
It's of her book, right?
Yeah.
With her writing. So the entire Mayan narrative is clearly fiction. He has written the final chapter of the Mayan thing, which is Tomas has been stabbed, and that whole sequence in which the guy who stabs him sees this transfigured future self, and he goes to the Tree of Life. That's Thomas's invention. So none of that happened, right? They're not reincarnated. And this is kind of heartbreaking. So then you realize that there's this wonderful scene on the roof where he comes out and finds her on the roof, and she's pointing to this nebula in the sky. And apparently only some Mayans believed that Xibalba was up there.
Yeah.
But that same idea does exist in some Gnostic beliefs. It does exist in other cultures. The idea that you would go to a star after you die. They didn't know what stars were, but so she has this beautiful sequence in which she recognizes that, and he takes her inside. So the idea is, after she died, he wrote that whole future narrative. That whole future narrative is fiction too. He didn't just write the final chapter. He wrote a whole other book, which is integrated into the narrative, and that whole transcendent future thing is his fantasy and him coming to terms with her death, and going to this place that she believed in. He's worked it into the narrative. So then, and that's why the transfigured self can appear in the end of the Mayan narrative.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what's going on with the present day narrative?
Yeah. And
what took me a while to figure out is that the present day narrative is fiction too. The present day narrative is autobiographical. It's based on a version of somebody dying, right? But there's no, all the stuff that, like, just like the historical inaccuracies bothered me upon first viewing, and then I realized, okay, it's fiction. It's an allegory. The present day stuff bothered me. Like, really, you've got this cutting from a tree, in Central America, and it heals this. Yeah, that's all fiction too, and that's why the future self can see the present day Izzy, and sort of whether he's hallucinating her or seeing her, and the future self has the tattooed line of the ring, the sort of shadow of the wedding ring, and the ring reappears before he dies, and he puts it on and replaces the darkness with a glowing
gold.
gold. And so really all of this is using science fiction. And this is why it may not technically be a science fiction film. It's using science fiction, using historical fiction to deal with death and deal with this terrible loss and the fact that, she never comes back. She's just dead. And what we have left is fiction. Now I'm going to pull. So I've already got like one level is the future narrative, the past narrative is fiction. The future narrative is fiction too. The present day narrative is tied to that fiction and is fictionalized. And then you mentioned the fountain. It's not the fountain of youth. It's the tree of life. The fountain is the fountain pen that she gives him.
Right.
And the ink of the fountain pen, that black ink, is the shadow version of the white kind of pus that comes out of the tree that grants life. And so what is the fountain of life? It's what we have in fiction to deal with the reality of death and what we don't know about life and about what happens after. So all of this is a meditation on death and on immortality and on the power of fiction and the role of fiction as a kind of recompense for losing people like Izzy.
That's a lot to process. But no, it is interesting that you said, because one of the things I read when I was sort of like, doing a little bit of side research, I don't know if I try not to do much research about the films because it can influence your viewing experience. But one of the things I did see was that Aronofsky sort of came off, and weirdly having seen The Matrix, and was like, oh, great. So people are sort of ready to talk about meta narratives or meta sort of realities, so I can go and do something. And sort of he took it to his extreme in this form. And so when you say about the fiction, there was a part of it that's like, okay, when I realized, because I was leaning towards this thing of being like, okay, so the Conquistador stuff is the book. Like, I understand that, but like it seemed to be pulling in Tommy so much. I was like, all right, but is he having some sort of like past life thingy, sort of throwback? But then I was like, but actually, he never remembers it or anything when he's in the future, because it's revealed obviously it's him in the future that's been there, lived for thousands of years. And so it does become this twisty turny sort of thing around the narrative. And then when he appeared as this sort of like Xibalba infused being, the meditative floating deity thing at the end, I was a bit like, okay, to me that was the moment where I was like, if you'd have kept one as a narrative and these as a sort of like except the fiction, we'll get onto this idea of death in a moment, but like, yeah, I'd have sort of accepted that. But then it sort of it just became, I don't know, it felt like if Alan Moore or Grant Morrison had done this in a comic, it's one of those where I'd probably rolled my eyes at it and gone, oh no, you've gone too far down. You're sort of this doesn't work for me in that sense of like it's too sort of, you've tried to be too twisty turny, and you've sort of felt it feels a bit like you've tied yourself in knots at that point. There's other bits that do work in it, but that one bit where it's like where the Mayan king leader or whatever swings that flaming sword, which by the way, again, like all that looks awesome. Like, again, costume design and set design on this is great. But then he stops because of this sort of floating thing. And then sort of it pans back, and it's because you see Tomas, the Conquistador, he's been stabbed, he's bleeding. And he presents his neck. And again, it's sort of like, okay, so the Conquistador didn't see him. He was he was replaced by him. It's that thing of like, I know it's supposed to be a meta fiction, but I'm like, at least it's got to work narratively, because then it shoots back and you say the Mayan King is still presenting his throat to a shabby looking conquistador.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, some of that is like, so I think the conquistador is seeing a vision of this, he's having a religious vision at that moment.
No, not then he isn't. No, that comes when he's after the tree. He does. He drinks the fluid from the tree and he sees the tree like illuminates and it sort of infuses and becomes. And then he sees Xibalba and it's sort of like the leaves start to twist and it becomes the sort of the heart of that nebula. All that stuff is great. I mean, it looks fantastic. But I get that bit. But the fact that like he just sort of like, because he looks confused. Like when the Mayan king has presented his throat to him, he's like, he's like, all right, slits his throat and they get on. But like he hasn't had a religious experience at that point.
No, I'm saying the Mayan has had this religious vision, right? So the Mayan response, but it's a kind of like, I mean, it's this sort of like Deus ex machina, like the character is defeated on the footsteps of his goal, and of course, there's a twist. Something surprises you that and it's mystical that the Mayan sees this thing, and so I love when you cut back to the grubby looking conquistador. He's like he's dirty, he's tired. He's just like all he knows is, I mean, this is also, so I guess it's like the West being less mystical. Like he's just like, no, this guy's exposing his throat. Like, do I take this opportunity or not? Like he's not thinking I'll water the soil with his blood in the name of free. He's just thinking, oh my God, I've got this chance, and he hesitates and then he kills him. But I quite like that.
Yeah, it's the fact that they jump into each other. Like I say, the Deus, ex machina sort of element of it. When that happens, that begins to bother me. I mean, one of the things I'd say is like the conquistador stuff. I want to get more into some of the stuff in that because there's a couple of things I like. But in the present day, this idea, if I'm going to take it in three, let's take it in three lumps. I like to take things, visually, right? Conquistador stuff. If it's all fictional, right? So this could be a prose novel, right? You could do this as a sort of a thing. But the conquistador stuff, the past is a fiction, right? It's a proper fiction. The present day stuff, there's going to be a fiction, but like you say, it's autobiographical or biographical. It's going to be, at least it's based in some form of reality. And then you get this far-flung future. But that present day and that far-flung future, you are given enough information to connect them. And there's other things you can start to connect. But you connect them by, at the end, towards the end of the thing, when Izzy dies, as you say, sort of Tommy comes in and he makes that speech. He sort of says, we've now found this element and we're gonna stop aging. We're gonna stop death. There's a cure for death. We are gonna find this thing.
Death is a disease like any other.
Yeah, and we're going to find a cure. We wouldn't have no more aging, no whatever. So by that point, I'm like, okay, so the future self is an actual future self. Like they succeeded. They found this thing, and he succeeded and lived for thousands of years. And we do not know what happened in those intervening years, but you get the gist. And then you get this element of, there's one other part there where they've talked about this, the first father, this Mayan tradition. And so I'm still accepting that the Mayan thing is a fiction. But Izzy, before she dies, she hands. They have this idea of the seed being planted in with the body, and that's how it happened. It was a seed that was planted in the body, and the tree of life grew from the first father, and that's what it was. And so you have this bit of Tommy plants a very specific seed into Izzy's grave, and so you then have this. For me. Is going to be that thousands in the future. That is Izzy. That tree is. I mean, obviously, that's the thing. To me, that tree, that seed grew through her grave, and so he's then basically got a plow and pulled it up and stuck it in a bubble, and he's flying through space with Izzy. And like you then say, you can question: is he hallucinating and seeing that past, that the 2006 her, or is it literally some projection from the tree, because you see the tree sort of breathes. It has sort of bristles that sort of that respond to touch and all that. That's a great idea. I love the fact this trees are living things, but this thing almost seems like it has both elements of flora and fauna that it's true life. It's all life, and that sort of thing. I love that concept.
Well, and those hairs on the side of the tree responding in extreme close-ups are like the hairs on the back of her neck that you had the same kind of extreme close-ups of.
Yeah, and so those sorts of moments, so I love that sort of that connection. So I'm accepting that, like, in the far future, he has got this thing, and he's taking her to this nebula that she was investigating, or she was, interested in, or meant so much to her, and her, what she was doing. So that to me means a lot. Like, he's done this over thousands of years, and then that's so basically it's almost like them dying together at the heart of this sun to become a single entity in the stars.
Mm-hmm.
But it still has a physicality to it. Ludicrous as it seems, and sort of this far-flung future, it's still the same Tommy that's lived for thousands of years and acquired this technology and is sort of now sat balding in a bubble floating through space. But it's still the same Tommy that we've been following, who's been looking for this thing. So it's sort of like those two have become a fixed, continual narrative supported by this fiction that we know, this conquistador fiction. So when the sort of like the floating Tommy, future Tommy, glowing Tommy appears in the sort of the conquistador thing, I'm sort of like that's where it breaks down for me, because I'm like, oh no, it's like if you're going to break that wall between those things, you've got to give me something else. And then you're saying, oh, the whole thing's a fiction. I'm like, great, it's all a fiction. It's all like a metafiction, but I still need. You are either keeping the two things separate, and they are sort of the metaphors and the sort of the thematic elements are still the same, are weaving together, or the stories weave together. And you're trying to do both, and it feels like a spaghetti junction of things at that point, because it's so fast as well. So much is happening. I'm just like, I don't know what's going on. I'm just being punched in the gut by a bunch of visuals that look great, but like that moment really, really bothered me.
What is the moment that bothered you?
The thing of the glowing, floating, meditating Tommy appearing instead of the conquistador, and it felt like such a cheat. And such a sort of like a mishmash between those two moments. That is the moment that actually broke it for me. I was like, now we're into waffly bollocks rather than.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. I don't feel that at all, though. I mean, I feel like, I don't want to say like, as a writer, but like.
No, you can, because you are.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that. Like, the movie knows that it's breaking that rule at that point, right? Like, it knows it's supposed to be startling that you're like, wait a minute, like I don't know if they're reincarnated or whatever. I mean, I'm just along for the ride, and it's like, wait a minute, that's that guy from the future narrative.
Yeah.
Like, how is he here? What's going on? I mean, it's supposed to be startling. I think what's amazing to me is that. Like you said, you have to use your brain with this movie. I think that you have to use your brain to get to like the conclusions that I've gotten to, which I don't know if they're definitive. I might feel differently tomorrow, or think differently. But what I think is most amazing about this movie is that I'm just along for the ride. And like you said, like it's every shot is beautiful. I mean. Every shot is all like it's beautiful. The music is beautiful, is wonderful, and it's so concise. I mean, this movie is like 1
hour 37. Yeah, 1 hour 37. It's really. I was surprised at how short it was.
And I love that. But the other thing is that every scene is emotionally right. Like and there's this thing that that I've realized as a writer. Which is that I plan out stories kind of, super structural. I'm a structuralist. I know all the story beats usually before I start writing. But when I know a scene feels right emotionally, you have to go with that. This is a movie that every single scene feels right emotionally for me. Yes. And it's gone for that every fucking time in a really daring way, and every scene has a heart and is stunning and is resonant and right, and and that gives it its kind of allegorical feeling. But I can see like that's seeing that transfigured guy in the Mayan narrative is such an interruption. Yeah, that's true, but it feels right. It feels like it's one of those moments where you think like, oh, I can't do this as a creator, right? Like that's from that other narrative, but it's like, no, they're all overlapping. That feels right. It feels right to me. Emotionally.
I know what you mean, and I agree to the extent that with that future narrative, that sort of projection into the future and where it heads, especially in that last sort of the third act, it feels. I agree, it feels right in that emotional sort of like it's bound to happen, but it doesn't mean it makes any bloody sense. Do you know what I mean? It's one of those things of like, I see this in a lot of films, and you sort of see it with a twist. It's sometimes when you see, the reveal in a horror film or the reveal in a thriller or something, you go, yeah, I can see why you've gone there, and I can see why you've done that. Like I can see why it's the long lost whatever, but I don't like it. And I sort of feel that like with the end of this film is like there's so much I like about this film, and then that one moment where they collide those two together, it needs to happen in what it's. I'm trying to explain. Okay, I'm gonna use Grant Morrison as a comparable on this. I'm sorry, it's my only source of reference on terms of reference for this.
Mm-hmm.
Grant Morrison has this sort of notion that, and whether people like it or not, or whether it works for people is a different question. But he uses this idea that the comics he creates are in fact a different universe. Like it exists. It's just a 2D universe, and sort of like whether he believes it or not it doesn't matter. But that's what he presents. So there are times that sort of like they'll have like fourth wall breaking, or they can have these things where there'll be comments like in the recent his Green Lantern. There's a moment where Green Lantern's like, hang on, did you feel that? Like that felt like a real shift. Like something happened between panels. Like there's there's these things like the characters that exist in a sort of in his Animal Man, the characters that exist in some sort of like limbo land until they are used again, and all this other stuff. And that sort of like when you do that sort of thing, and you can do things like that, like inter-panel things, or you can have two narratives that then sort of collide because you're like, well, actually they technically exist in the same book. Like you are holding a book, so they exist in the same book. So yes, they can talk to each other. When you play that out, you go, yeah, all right, it can sort of work. I can see where you're going with it. But it's sort of usually sort of set up in some way. Like this didn't feel like that's been set up. It just felt like, right, now they're going to collide together. Like, there's not enough. I didn't feel there was enough to bring the Conquistador and that future thing to have to earn that overlap.
Well, I mean, I think the way that it's set up is that that is the ending that he wrote.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you're watching a dramatization of a work of fiction within the movie. And where her narrative ends, her work ends, and where his began. And so oh, this is what he wrote. This is, and maybe it's daft, but this is what he wrote. And so the question isn't, I mean, like, I know what you're saying, and you and I are going to be on the same page in all of those horror movies where we're like, yeah, interesting twist. Fun twist. He wasn't the brother all along.
Exactly.
You didn't work this through. But this isn't that kind of movie. This is not, I mean, it's like if that same movie started as like guys around the campfire and they said, I'm going to tell you a story about the crook hooked killer of the woods. And then the whole movie told that. And at the end, you're like, it's the brother. And you cut back to the campfire. That's a lot more forgivable because now it's a twist that those guys came up with. And the fact that it doesn't totally make sense kind of itself makes sense.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying, and that's almost like But what I'm saying is, this film does enough in other. Like, okay, there's. I'll give you an example of something else in this film. Isabella, this is something I love. Like, it really struck me. This did when you're introduced to Isabella, and he walks into that room with the floating candles, right, and they're all hung up, and it looks fantastic. Isabella is wearing a brown dress, and she wears this. This is sort of like the outfit that defines her, sort of like different periods in time. She's wearing this brown dress. It's brown on it, and what you find is, from a point, is when you see that dress, the brown is shaped like the trunk of a tree, and down the back of her dress is this collection of roots. And when you are first introduced to her, there's a veil in front of her, like a wooden veil, a wooden partition between her and the conquistador and the other people, and it's made up of leaves.
Like in a kind of confessional.
Exactly, yeah, and she's there writing something. So when you first see her, she is presented as a tree, for want of a better phrase. Like, the costuming tells me she is linked with this tree. So when you get to the end, you know, when Izzy dies, and you have that tree in the bubble, that's where I'm going. Oh, that's the tree that's grew out of her, because she is the tree.
You're right about that.
And so, okay, again, I'm like, okay, good. I'm fine with that. That, because it's brilliant, and it's really, you know, it's nice and subtle, and it's beautifully done. And also the fact that, like, you know, she is writing, and she's sort of like, when you were introduced to Queen Isabella, she's writing, and she sort of makes a reference to sort of writing then. So again, this connection of fiction, this idea of writing things between Isabella and Izzy. So I'm sort of like, okay, this is a continuation. So there's these themes, and again, like you say about this idea of death, like, you know, another thing as well. So that sort of, to me, projects into the future. So you have this idea of the tree going through to the future. When you go through to the present, their bed, you know, when you sort of in their bedroom, the head of their bed carved into the wood is a big star, projecting again into the next element. So it's all there. Like, you're going, okay, this is this, and that goes into that. Like, again, like, this is all background stuff, and I love the fact that they've done this wonderfully woven. And there's more. There's so much more that when you look around, you spot these things. And there was a couple of things where I had to rewind, and I was like, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to check that because I spotted something there. And they have the more forefront stuff, like when she goes to the Mine Museum and you see they tell you about the First Father. So if they're going to do that, and that's great, and that's where I'm going. This is all the stuff I'm loving. Then they need to have this idea of fiction woven into this so much more, in a much more sort of substantial way. This idea of sort of fiction being so important, because the book is important, the story is important to her, and so I was hoping that they would have something along the lines of how. Because maybe I missed it, but this idea of you said it, like this idea that fiction is what we have. It's how we remember people. It's how we can, you can write these things down. But that's never like fundamentally sort of it doesn't have to be said. But I wanted something more that says about how fiction is important in this narrative. How we can sort of project things. We can, the people we can't save in real life, we can save in fiction and all this other stuff, which is important to our sort of human stories. And it just felt, so when that thing happens at the end and the two sort of like, those fictions collide or overlap, it would have been better if that idea of, the importance of overlapping or colliding fictions or whatever had been woven in that little bit more, like other elements had been.
I see what you're saying. I don't disagree with it. I mean, the structuralist in me is like, yes. Put that conversation in, just one little conversation with Izzy before she dies about the role of fiction.
I'd have a small conversation with the conquistador and someone talking about, him talking to the father about the stories in the Bible and saying like, I don't believe them all, right. Because they're supposed to, as you say, they were all literalists, but like, but they do tell us more. These fictions tell us more, then have something in the present that's more about the use of fiction and how it can help, and then so on and so forth. Like that would have been there'd have been something there. I think I could have hung my hat on a little bit.
I mean, I think you're right. The counter argument that I would make is that in a movie where so much is indicated visually, that title card is from her book.
True.
Okay. You're watching that book.
Yes.
This is an adaptation of the book that he wrote using her material as like a third of it. So I mean, I do think it's there. But the other thing that I would say is that I think you're right structurally. I mean, I think that is the right answer. However, you don't have to understand anything about this movie. Like, you can do this intellectual work. It's there. What I love about this is like, you were talking about like movies that have like a twist, right?
Yeah.
And like the classic detective story is like, who's the killer? And in a good detective story, it was always could only be that answer, right? Mm-hmm. And that you had the clues, blah, blah, blah. There's one answer. And so you do that work and you have to do that work. This is not that kind of story.
No.
It doesn't matter if you get to any answer. It doesn't matter. It's an allegory. It's a mystical experience. And the more I see this, the more I realize that, I mean, this is going to sound so corny, but this is a movie that benefits from scraping at it and, picking that bark off and getting at the truth. But ultimately, what matters is the emotional experience of that allegory. What matters is if you feel something, if you were taken somewhere, and those emotional responses to scene after scene. Like your emotional response, while it was a negative response to the transfigured, lotus position dude appearing in the Mayan narrative, is, that emotional response is ultimately what matters here. If you watch the ending with him being consumed by the nova and sort of merging with the tree and the tree blossoming, does that make sense? I mean, does that mean that they're now one entity together? I mean, what matters is it emotionally resonant to you? Does it express a mystical truth to you? If it makes sense, I mean, it doesn't literally make sense. But then again, I retreat and I say, what's heartbreaking to me is that doesn't happen. Is that, we want to believe that we're, it's like the idea that like you plant somebody's, what Izzy had that vision, right? Of like, she had a dream of like a Mayan told her that when you die, the first father was, consumed and whatever, and that, he was in this tree, and that when, birds ate from the fruit, now he was flying. That's some John Donne fucking lies, right? Like, that's just like, no, you're dead. Yeah. Some of your biological material might be now in that bird, but you are not flying, right? And I hate that kind of sophistry, that kind of equivocation. But it's still poetic and it's still touching. I think what's heartbreaking for me is this movie can give me that emotional shit, right? And I can totally embrace it. But it also gives me this logical framework where I can accept all of that because it's a work of fiction and because there are those answers there if you want to scratch. And I can go on that, I can open my heart to this emotional journey and to what's being presented scene by scene and go on an emotional journey. And I have that logical framework there if I want it. And the interaction between those two is itself kind of heartbreaking to think like, yeah, that's a story we tell ourselves. That's some John Donne poetry there, right? You don't live on in that bird.
No, and I agree with that. I mean, that's one of the things I did like about this film is there are bits and pieces in this one that I think are great. Like you say, there's you and I share a sort of similar philosophy when it comes to this thing. Like, when I'm dead and I'm buried, plant a tree in me, whatever you want. I'm not a part of that tree. Well, I am. Like you say, I'm not. I am. Will be a part of the tree. I will be sustenance for that tree, or whatever. Doesn't mean I'm going to have, some mystical experience as a leaf. It's not that. I get that. I'm not going to have some sort of like consciousness within that living being. But what the thing, and again, this comes to where sort of like the things you are right. There is an emotional reaction to this film, and I like that ending. Forget the floating bald guy, because again, it's sort of it is jarring, and I don't like it. And it doesn't help that it's a floating Hugh Jackman in pajamas, and it felt a bit silly. And that's fine. But that moment when he does get to that meditative state, and he's sort of like he's floating towards Shabala, but he's in that position, and the tree is behind him, and as he gets closer, that thing sort of like is spinning around beneath him. And then when the nova goes, there's a great moment when it sort of like, instead of it obviously does that thing, it sucks into itself, it compacts down to the the idea of the Big Bang. And again, it obviously links back to that, because it's this compaction of matter and energy into this infinitely small point, and then it explodes. And in that moment, there's this idea of in the moments of death come this moments of creation, and that's what it is. And I actually like that thing where the sort of like you see him blasted and his clothes are blasted off, and then he's being vaporized. But in the same moment, the tree is growing and it's sort of like absorbing this energy or whatever. Like, I really like that, actually. That moment looks cool, and that's sort of the ending. That's sort of, you're left sort of with that. All those moments. But what I sort of got from this, especially from the middle bit, or let's say the sort of present day narrative, was this idea, and it's a little cliched, but it sort of I strongly felt it, was this idea of all the time, and it's clearly there, but all the time he is sort of spending trying to save Izzy, this energy that he's putting into sort of saving her, he spends at the hospital, and it keeps going back to this one moment, and I love it. It's so well done, sort of this idea of, and again, it's sort of, this is the subtlety of this film. He has this memory or this sort of hallucination. He keeps going back to it. She's sort of like, she's all wrapped up, and she's like, look, let's go for a walk. It's the first snow of the season. And he's like, I can't, just leave me to it. I've got to continue with this work. They're relying on me. And he's doing the work to save her, but his dedication means he's actually literally missing out on moments with her. And that's what's heartbreaking to me. Because there's a moment where he's in the hospital and they find out that this thing is regenerative, or whatever you call it, rejuvenative. It's sort of helping the ape. It's got this sort of, its synapses and its bodies are all recuperating, but the tumor is never dealt with. And his boss is going like, these are great results. Look at what we've got. Like, we can do this great stuff. And he's going, but it's not the results I want. I've got to keep working. And even she's going like, your energies are directed in the wrong place. Get yourself to the hospital and spend your time with boss. Yeah.
Right. His female boss says, what are you doing?
Listen, what are you doing here? Like, she's in hospital. You should be there with her. And that really resonated with me, of this idea of like, he says we're going to cure death. Death is a disease we're going to cure. And it clearly happens. Like, that's what the future self tells me. But it was a waste, because he still didn't save Izzy. And I'm like, and to me, the bit that like is heartbreaking to me, and it really does resonate with me, is this idea of like, you could spend this time, you can justify your time in one way, but life goes on, like shit keeps moving, and we're doing this, and like this I sit in this office fucking day in, day out. And for other reasons, just so listeners, like I work here. Like, this isn't just, I don't just sit here.
He makes podcasts 24 hours a day.
Yeah, but you do, you could do that, but then you've got to go out. You've got to interact with people. There are, and this will, you and I talk. We talk before and sometimes after that we record, and this, you get that interaction, and you get that you build a relationship with friends and family, and those people that are important, or you can give a justification of, well, I've got to work and I've got to do this, and that's important, and sort of like, I'm doing this for you, so you've got a future, and you go, well, but you're missing the present. And that's the thing, that kept coming through to me, was like, this is a story about, because this is a story about regret. Like, he spent thousands of years or hundreds of years or whatever to get to this point of being able to get to Shibala Shibalba, to basically try and redeem himself for the moments he lost when Izzy was alive. And so I know, you said it's narrative, but to me, I see this person at the end of this film that has dedicated, like, they've literally conquered death so he could redeem himself with this grand act in the far future. And I'm like, this is this idea of grief and moving on and stuff. But he's obviously so haunted by this one moment. It's sort of like it's centralized into this one moment, this walk in the snow that didn't happen. And that's what's heartbreaking to me. It's absolutely sort of like, because they replay it, don't they? He gets the opportunity to do it again, and he chooses to do it this time.
Which is one of the key scenes that makes me say, yeah, the present day stuff is fiction too. Not only because you need it for the future stuff to make sense.
Yeah, but that's what I sort of kept saying. I watched this film and I was like, when I was watching those moments, I'm like, this is a film about grief. This is a film about sort of regret and looking back and going like, look, what if, or what could I have done differently? And so, when you get to the sort of like the floaty monk stuff, I'm like, I'm sort of like you said, it felt right because of the way it was heading. Like, it's clear that that's what's going to happen. But I'm still like, that's not what I'm taking from this film, and maybe that's why it didn't work for me. But you're right, that the emotional impact of this film is important. You can take different things from it, but that's where I was more focused on that present day than I was on the different bits and pieces. But like, that thing of like the tattooing as well, when he sort of like he has them up his arm, and he actually says at one point like there are rings around his arm, like he's continued to do that tattooing
like a tree.
And it says he says about memories. He says all those years, and you've been with me, and all these memories, all those memories. It's like he has those memories, but there are obviously those moments he wishes like he was either at the surgery. He lost the ring, when he loses his ring in the surgery, and how important that. And he obviously replaces it with that tattoo. But it's that point of like, you lost yourself, you lost this relationship at that surgery, at that sort of at that laboratory. That's what that meant to me, was like, you've pissed away some of this in that laboratory, like, a part of you. And
it's a little direct as a metaphor, right? Like, but damn it if it doesn't work. I mean, I have a couple thoughts about what you're saying. I mean, one is that, although I see that future narrative as fiction, it is deeply emotionally resonant that this is what we do for love. Like I would go, I go to the ends of the earth. This guy goes to the ends of the universe, for her. And that love doesn't die, and that love carries forward, and that's love. It's emotionally resonant. The thing about him in the present, I respond to very strongly too. And I think that as I get older, I am more the Hugh Jackman who would go for the walk in the snow. And I think wisdom gives you that. You and I are both men.
Yeah.
We both are men of a certain class. We are both prone to workaholic tendencies.
Yes.
And we have these ideas of accomplishment, right? Of being a conquistador, or, being the doctor who, makes this discovery that changes everything, and being, taking pride in being good at our jobs. And a lot of us have had I'll speak for myself, have had, fathers who took pride in their work, in, sort of, work ethic, but who weren't there emotionally, or didn't know how to be there emotionally. Watching this, I think about people I've lost. I think about where I was when I first saw this. I mean, it doesn't compare to a wife, but I recently lost a dog, and she was on hospice for a very long time. There'd be days where I barely saw her, but I think, I need to be present for her. And I would spend a good portion of the next day petting her, touching her, reassuring her, giving her treats, playing with her, and really making sure that I was present so that I didn't regret that time. And I've learned that, I mean, I'm a different man now than I was at 25 when I would have said all that matters is that work. And when I've been close to death and had opportunity to think about it, it's, it is the love that we remember. I was overwhelmed by a sense of love, and I was overwhelmed by a sense of I could remember every petty, stupid thing that I'd done, and how filled with love my life had been. And all the people I'd known, parents, friends, girlfriends, how much love was there and how much love I had, but how wrapped up in, just petty, stupid shit that you're not only are you not going to remember on your deathbed, but you're not going to remember in a week, like, did this person use the right word talking to me or something, or,
It's interesting because you say that. So I actually went to a funeral a week ago, which was interesting. Sort of going to a funeral, sort of like literally after you just turned 40, puts things in perspective a little bit. But it was actually for Alex's, my wife's aunt. She died of cancer. She'd been sort of dealing with it for some time, and she'd sort of gone into remission and then it come back, and there'd been a bit of a roller coaster, and finally it sort of took her in October. Oh, sorry, end of November. And I was never close. I've met her a couple of times. That side of the family, I knew them, but not in an intimate way. Not close. Alex knew obviously a lot better than I. But you go to this thing and you observe, and obviously pay your respects and stuff. But there were two things there that sort of like you see the people that she had affected, and she was a teacher and she taught adults, and it was interesting to see the people that stood up and were like, "Oh no, this is she had this impact on my life," or she was this friend, and it does make you think. And that's again, like watching this film, having that in the back of my head, I was like, that's probably why it sort of centered this film for me on that and that this idea of the moments. But she played anything. She did, but like, well, they played at the funeral. The specials, enjoy yourself. The lyrics sort of enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. Enjoy yourself. The years go by as quickly as a wink, and all this other stuff. So the lyrics in that song sort of like stuck with me for that same reason. Again, watching this film, I'm like, this idea of time passing. And time passing in different versions. It shows you three different versions of time, like whether it be fantasy or fiction or whatever. But this idea of sort of like, the 1500s through to present day, through to the far future, and this idea of just time passing, and this idea of the devotion to someone that that whether you love or friends or whatever. And again, it felt interesting to watch. Her husband and her son, and sort of, these are the people reminiscing about sort of like times past, and this idea of time passing and how important it can be. You need the passing of time to form memories, and memories are important. And that sort of stuck with me. And so I think when I was watching this film, this idea of memories and those key moments in people's lives and how we can influence them. And again, that sort of thing of making the right decision, of saying, no, I am going to put this down and we are going to go for a walk. Or, I am going to do this instead of this, or whatever, is important. And I will admit, right here and right now, like, I'm not always good at it. Like you say, like, I am definitely guilty of people in my life saying, have you got a minute? And I'm going like, no, I've got to get this finished, or I'm doing this, or I'm whatever. Or worse, saying yes, but then being fucking stroppy about doing it, sort of like, yeah, fine, we'll do it. And then, being a dick about it. But you do realize as you get older, you got to do these things. And the other thing was, there was a Mark Twain quote which was hugely relevant to me, which was my life has been a series of tragedies, most of which never happened. And I'm often like that. Like, I have anxiety where I'm like, I will work shit up in my head where I'm like, I've got this meeting on Thursday, it's going to go badly, I know it's really going to be difficult, and for the rest, I won't sleep for that week. And it happens, and it goes fine, and you come out the end of it, and you're like, why? Why did I spend so much energy on that? And so that was sort of all that sort of been playing in my head a little bit. And I think, so watching this film and watching it when she does pass, and that moment when sort of she does pass, and the rage in him, he tries to bring her back, and he sort of blames the doctors and this other stuff. And I'm like, he's not angry. I love the fact that, like, it's clear he's not angry with them. Like, in that moment, like, it's clear, like, he's still so angry with himself. And I completely sort of understood that. And again, so going back to, so I was like, that meant so much. That was like, okay, that's the sort of the important bit. That's what I'm taking from this. And then so when he dedicates however long to this idea of getting to Shambhala, just sort of like, it meant, I was like, okay, that's really important. Like, he sort of, that's what I meant by it's about regret, and redemption. Like, this is so important to this act. But yeah, that's sort of where I was my head was at.
I love what you're saying, brother. And I was thinking yesterday about how we spend so much time, to that Mark Twain quote, we spend so much time being anxious about things that either don't matter, or we have no control over.
Yeah.
And what I was thinking, what often occurs to me is that 99% of our worry and anxiety is for nothing. And it does not make us better at dealing with that thing, because it does not improve anything. It just makes us miserable. But what I was thinking yesterday was, when I was 16, I was worried about, what clothes I was wearing and what it expressed about me as a person, and what bands I was into, and whether a girl liked me, whether I was, what I was really worried about was whether I was lovable, whether I was likable, whether I was worth a shit. And then, but I wouldn't have been scared of COVID. I wouldn't have been scared of dying in a car accident. I wouldn't have been scared. I mean, that wasn't going to happen to me.
You're immortal when you're 16.
Right. And now, like, no, I worry about these things. Now I worry about real things. And a lot of people, I don't have kids, but it's like they'll have a kid and be like, oh, now I know what there is to worry about. I used to worry about some bullshit. Now I know. So that comes back to me. And it's often the walks in the snow that we remember most. When I first watched this, I'll drop this now. It was 2006, and I watched this with my girlfriend at the time, Nancy, who is still the longest relationship I've had. I was in Hawaii, and her father had just died of cancer, and he had been dying for a while, and then he went pretty quickly. And I went to the funeral, but I did not go to the hospital. And she said, "No, don't come." And I was busy being stupid, we met when, she was sort of like young 20s and I was late 20s. And, I was busy being stupid and caring about, my career and, all my anxieties and, we watched this in the theaters. And I've never had an experience like this in my life. At the end of this, we just began to cry. And we held each other in the theater and cried through the entire end titles. Over the finality of death. And now looking back, I think we loved each other very much, but we were still young and stupid, and we would fight. I don't remember what any of those fights were about. I mean, they were about dumb shit like, being inconvenienced and not feeling the other one respected our time enough, or words, or
didn't respond to a text with a certain time frame.
Right, and then I'm not gonna let this be the new rule of the relationship. I'm going to fight and fight, and it was all that petty, stupid shit. But there was love there, and in time, it's the love that you feel. It's the love that matters. That was a wonderful moment, watching this film, and that pettiness that I had and she had was, no, being angry. I've got to work. I've got to, that sort of distraction from what really truly matters. And that doesn't mean like the relationship has to survive. It doesn't mean like this is your Isabella. You are born and reincarnated forever. It just means these are the memories we have at the end. Yeah.
No, there's definitely this idea, like you said, and I love that. I love the fact you were able to do that in the cinema. I think I'd have, firstly, my Britishness would not allow me to show any emotion outside of the house. It's not. There's a law against it here. There definitely will be under Boris, anyway. But yeah, no, it feels. You can do that. The other thing is, I actually want to flip this round a little bit. In that. And this bit becomes a bit of a Hollywoodism or a commercialism, is this idea of soulmates. It does dally with that idea, doesn't it? This sort of like, this idea of, because it has the actors playing Tomas and Isabella, and then obviously they have this idea of this grand mission to space to get to this dying nebula for this thing with this tree of life. Or with this tree that's growing out of us. So this is where I sort of, how to explain it. We've talked about these things, this idea of there's moments in life, and it's about the finality of death, and we do we cling to these ideas, whether it be religion or whatever, to help us deal with death, because we have grief, we miss these people, and that's completely understandable and completely acceptable. But then you get these ideas that become these things in Hollywood films of sort of like, okay, well, beyond this point, you've then almost got to like dedicate your life to the memory of that person, or they are your soulmate, and this other thing. And it becomes almost, to me, not dangerous, probably too strong a word, but worrisome, that then you're like, oh, so you're telling people that they should move on. Right. There has to be some grand moment for them to be able to sort of like break free of their grief. And that feels dangerous from a mental health point of view, when you're like, you've got to carry this weight around. No, if anything, it should be a moment you do go, this person has died, has passed, and I do miss them and I grieve for them, and it's heartbreaking, and there are moments when I don't know what to do with myself because I feel that sadness or whatever. However, there are other people in my life that are still here and bring joy to me, and I want to take that, because now I have this realization that we are only here for a period of time, and it does stop. And so I don't want to sort of have those moments soured by this. Do you know what I mean? It sort of feels... Yes,
I do. I know exactly what you mean. Hugh Jackman should... I mean, so watching this time, I thought... I mean, I find Izzy's death and her being ready to go when he's not ready to let her go very touching and very painful and very true to life. However, I found myself feeling like it's almost as if she wants to say, I want you to move on.
Yes.
Like, finish this book, but like, don't, I mean, he's still relatively young. And so many couples, when somebody dies young or middle age, the partner who dies will say, please move on with your life. Don't grieve me forever. Don't turn me into an icon,
yes,
a fetish object. to venerate and stay static, like you're saying. And I do think it's dangerous what you're talking about. I would use that word, but she doesn't say that.
No, she doesn't. No.
And really, what he should do is finish grieving. Finish the book and be a better colleague to these wonderful people at his work and say, like, I'm sorry to his boss, and take the time to be present with them. I think you're right. That is dangerous, and I think it does play into this trope, and like we're united forever, and literally the soulmates, right? Like, because that comes from Plato writing about sort of two halves of the same soul that are split. I mean, preposterous nonsense.
Yeah.
And yes, it is dangerous, and it causes people to fixate. The only thing that I would say to that, I agree with you, but the only thing I would say is that my reading of this is that this is his grieving process. Writing that is his grieving process. And when you're in the throes of that pain, you want to go to the end of the universe and be with that person forever. I would have died to save my dog. I mean, I'm a human being. I'm a smart motherfucker. I would have died to save that dog's life. And that's what love is. But you grieve and you move on, and you've got to be there for the people who are in your life. And, it is what it is. So, I mean, so I agree with you 100%. I always think that's dangerous in movies. I would just say my reading is that what we're getting is the byproduct of that.
Someone working through their grief.
Right.
That sounds like a healthier output. But the character of Tommy in this isn't that, because he spent thousands of years to do something else to redeem himself for this simple act. In
the fountain that he writes.
Yeah, I get that, but as I'm saying, the characters we see on screen, the narrative I'm following on screen tells you're saying this is you're saying this is a narrative that someone has produced as a way of working through their grief, and that's fine. I understand that, but there's what is actually on screen is a character that spends hundreds of years battles death and aging to get through a moment, and it actually takes the destruction of a nebula for them to still go, oh yeah, I should move on. Oh shit, I can't move on. I've just been destroyed.
Well, and maybe then he's reincarnated because he's like the first father, kind of.
Yeah. So it's that sort of thing, and it did make me think about that. So there is that element. You can get that element when I do, and I find that frustrating in Hollywood when they do have those moments. I mean, it happens. It happens in real life. You hear of especially in elderly people that sort of like one dies and the other one dies soon after. They say sort of through heartbreak or whatever. And obviously Queen Victoria sort of spent the remainder of her life in mourning after the death of Albert. Sort of these things happen.
That about Queen Victoria?
Well, she wore black, and that was it.
I mean.
I think she was just a grumpy person, and she was looking for an excuse and was like, "Bob on, I'm happy now. I can be horrible to people, and I can then blame it on this thing." But yeah, there is that. But I want to go to. There's a couple of other things that I mentioned about this film that
real quick interject that the taking up of the traits of somebody who's died is also. Can be a good thing, but is also dangerous, right?
Yes.
And you see this often where it's like, I kind of like this, but now that I had a friend who killed himself with a heroin overdose, and one of the things we had in common was Transformers. Lo and behold, after he died, I started jumping back into collecting it hardcore, where we take up these traits, and I think the completion of the novel. Not just writing that final chapter, but then turning it into 3 times bigger. That's also potentially a dangerous thing. So just to cement your point.
Well, it becomes the obsession, doesn't it? This point of obsession that we justify as being like, no, it's important for this person that's dead, or like for their memory or whatever. Like it becomes this obsession. So, and I have seen it as well. Less serious though, and that sort of thing. I do want to go. There's a few moments in this film where choices are made, and it does feel like you go right, because everything else is so beautiful, it's so well done. But then there are moments, and maybe it's just in my head. Maybe this is more of a comment on me, I suppose, maybe. But especially the scene. So there's a scene where you go back and you see the Spanish Inquisition, and you see this sort of the chief inquisitor, and he's sat, and he's, you know, he's first he's self-flagellated, so he's, you know, he's whipping his back and all that sort of stuff. And I'm like, oh Jesus, all that fine. I'm happy, you know, not happy, but I understand all that. But then you get to this, you get to the moment where he's obviously got some heretics that are hanging upside down, and he's giving this speech, and it sort of zooms out and a little bit, and he's surrounded by these others, some in hoods, some in these whatever. And I could not get Life of Brian out of my head. Like, I was expecting like one of those people hanging upside down to be like, "Excuse me, you know, like, I'm not supposed to be here today." You know, or, "Oh, no, I'm not a heretic. You are a heretic. He's not he's a heretic. I'm not a heretic." Like, it just felt like this was so heavy-handed. It almost felt, and I get this supposed to be fantasy to an element, like it's a fictional thing, but like if this is what Izzy was writing, she needs an editor for a start. But it felt so heavy in parody that I almost felt like this was a comedy scene, and it's one of the few scenes in the film where I'm like, they've gone too far with this. Like, this is one of those ones where you start to do the set, or you do something, you can pull this back, because you've gone from feeling that this is a villain to feeling like this is a panto villain. You know, this is someone that's pantomime. This is a bit too silly. And it literally made me chuckle when I was watching it. I was like, if I'm chuckling at this, then it's the wrong. You say about the emotional impact. That, you know, I'm not supposed to be thinking this looks silly. You know, I'm supposed to feel that this is a threat to the Queen. I don't know if you thought that. There was that scene in particular that just I was like,
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely it's overdone. I mean,
Yeah.
it's melodramatic. I mean, I guess I wasn't bothered by it this time. I was probably bothered by it, you know, an earlier viewing. It is overdone. I mean, I sort of find it to be, I mean, you know, to be describing a kind of mentality, you know, the sort of mentality that says this body is a cage and I'm freeing you by killing you. And obviously the flagellants existed, you know, and they still do. I mean, we have records of people going through medieval towns, you know, like
whipping them.
yeah, and clearly deriving sexual pleasure from it, which they don't want to admit. You know, but also knowing the real Ferdinand and Isabella, you know, I mean, they were monsters, and you know, the irony of like, yeah, they confessed once I tortured them and they were eager to die, and so we're gonna seize their. I mean, it's overdone, you know, but the whole Inquisition is overdone in a historical. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I sort of take it to be a depiction of a certain kind of mentality that says this body is a cage and I'm freeing you. Except when I push too hard on that, then you know, Hugh Jackman's mentality and the sort of fiction that's presented has some of the same problems in that the answer to your body is a cage, you know, this bullshit is like, no, if that's true, then why are you avoiding death, right?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if you really believe you're going to an eternal paradise, you should not be sad about people dying and shouldn't be avoiding death. And if you are, I'm sorry, you're a liar. You don't really believe what you think you do. But in the same token, like, that sort of dumb mysticism is replaced by, I mean, that represents the darkness, the shadow of, you know, the stabbing yourself with a pen, you know. But then, you know, there's this journey from darkness to light. But then the light is like this other mystical thing of being united with her forever and becoming a tree and, you know, sort of like Eastern Shambhala sort of stuff, you know, which, okay, it's more beautiful, it's less destructive than, you know, us good European way of doing it, but it's also mumbo jumbo.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's I like the idea that say that it's the antithesis of the end. It's this idea of sort of like you say the organized versus the sort of small, the openly spiritual, I suppose. It's just, yeah, I get the point. It was just the sort of setup, like, because there's so much thought is put into so many other scenes that it just felt like this scene just felt so out of place. And the only other quibble I had with this film,
You're right. Yeah.
the only other quibble I had with this film is this is sort of like post Wolverine for Hugh Jackman. So this is him sort of trying to shake some of that off. And unfortunately, like, he has certain traits that, like, I think he has. I don't think he's ever going to win an Oscar. Like, let's not overplay it. But he has grown as an actor in certain roles. But there are certain things that, like, there's a lot of Hugh Jackman eyebrows going on in this film. And the way they film him, there's several scenes where he does like a turn, or it'll be sort of like a focusing on his face, and all I can think of is like, well, you're bringing Wolverine to this role, aren't you? And it's not, again, not a bad thing, but I can get past it. But it was that quibble where I'm like, where like Rachel Weisz is a wonderfully subtle actress, and she's got she's a very good actress. He often sort of like hits those melodramatic notes. Again, where I'm like, it's a little heavy-handed, and and I often think this when I watch a film, and I'm like, I wonder who I would have cast separately, like who would have done this and done it differently. But yeah, there's just a few moments where he does things, and again, I'm sort of like, that made me. I'm grinning at that, and I don't think I should be, and it's because it's the way it's been presented, the way that's been shot. Looks they're leaning into the silly when I don't think they should. They don't mean to be. But other than that, like, I think this film is absolutely beautiful. Like the cinematography, the set design, and costume in it is spot on throughout. There was one other thing. Sorry, there was something I was going to mention. So there was a thing about snow. That thing of walking in the snow as well, when she calls him out and he says, no, I can't go, is the fact that, like, the next thing you realise is she has she's lost sensitivity. Because she's sat, and the way they recognise it is because she's sat out on the balcony or sat out on the roof looking at the nebula, and she hasn't got any shoes on, and she can't feel the cold in the snow. And then later on, she sort of like heats up the sponge, and he sort of runs it down her legs, and she's like, I can't feel that. And again, so this idea of sort of they obviously link it to the tumor to say she's losing sensitivity. It's part of the brain sort of like dysfunction. But this idea of like the opportunity to have walked in the snow, which is clearly this sort of like this sensory experience that you experience, these sense memories that you create. She can no longer have those, even though she's here. Like, she can't have those anymore. Like, again, sort of like makes that moment so much more important. That, she can't feel the cold. She can't feel, so she couldn't feel the wind on her face. She couldn't recognize the feel of the snow and this other stuff. That's sort of, to me, it was just saying sort of like, inch by inch, the opportunity to have those moments is being taken from him, and he's not recognizing it. There's just something else I wanted to sort of throw in from before.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it gets back to that theme of sort of embracing those moments that really matter and being present.
Yeah.
The thing about, I know what you're saying about Hugh Jackman, and I have not been especially in love with him in a lot of roles. I think he's fine as Wolverine. I think there are a few moments in this where I think, that tone is a little off, or that's a little too direct. And it is those sort of like spinning moments. On the other hand, there are a lot of moments where he emotes where I think he's great. And I think that if this were the only thing I knew him from, I'd think, oh, that was a good performance. Not perfect, not as good as she is, as Rachel Weisz, but it's a solid performance. And I think it's hard to detach actors from what we know them from. Apparently, Brad Pitt and Russell Crowe were also considered for this. You know, neither of whom would be better than Jackman, frankly.
No. But in 2006, if that's your top line, Brad Pitt, Russell Crowe, and Hugh Jackman, that tells you exactly what thing they were looking for when they made this. So, yeah. But
I mean, presumably a headliner.
Yeah, exactly. It's a name that they can put on it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's if not Hugh Jackman's best performance, certainly, you know, I mean, well, The Prestige is up there too, but I mean, you know, Hugh Jackman can do it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You know, and it's not you know, an Oscar best performance of the year, but it's a serious performance, and I think this is one of those movies that shows he can do it. But he is upstaged by, I mean, Rachel Weisz is steals the show.
Oh yeah, she's fantastic in this, in every way. I think the thing is, because he's a stage actor originally, he's a musical stage actor, and I think the problem with Hugh Jackman, and I'll put this out there, one of the problems with Hugh Jackman is when the moment you put him in a costume that's outside of the norm, is that there's like a switch in him. Put him in like everyday clothes, and he's all right. Like, he can do a great performance. Put him in a costume, and all of a sudden he gets a little bit, you know, it's like you know, he ratchets that up to that next level, and it's like doesn't always need it. So, you know, in pajamas in a bubble doing something, there's a few moments where I'm like, okay, just tone it down. And the same with him as the Conquistador. And it's the same in other films. It works in, you know, Greatest Showman because it's a big musical, you know, those sorts of films. But like, again, Prisoners with him and this is a Denis Villeneuve film, he's excellent in.
Yeah,
he's really good in. But it's all normal clothes. I'm taking that as a rule now. There you go.
Yeah, there are certain actors who, you know, I mean, Russell Crowe and Brad Pitt are kind of the same way, right? Like, they both done decent performances, but there's something of, you know, I mean, even Russell Crowe in Gladiator. I mean, you put somebody in. I mean, Brad Pitt in Troy is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. You know, not for lack of trying, but yeah, I think there is a costume rule that you're getting at. Like,
yeah, put someone in a sort of like a period costume, and all of a sudden it all goes pear shaped. Not pear, you know what I mean? But I mean, I love Gladiator, but yeah, there are moments in that as well when you sort of go, oh well, you know. It's not for all of us, but yes. And the thing is, I'm not sure there's much else I can say about this film. So it's weirdly sort of like I think one of the things to say about this film is, like, we've talked about films, especially recently, you know, with Vanilla Sky and Open Your Eyes, where there's like a real like narrative drive, and there's sort of like, you know, it's all about those sort of characters, and it's sort of like, you know, there's those moments that were so important. But with this film, it's an hour and a half long. It's very concise. It's very sort of pointed. Like, and it felt poetry is probably a good description of this film. This film is to play like poetry, and so there's no real, like, you know, I'm not looking for like character development. I'm not looking for like sweeping epic narratives. Like, you know, yes, they are sort of there, and I've already said my piece around the sort of the narrative structures. But it's like, yeah, this film is more like, say, it's poetry about something.
Yeah.
And I think it should be taken in that way. You know, if I was to rewatch it, I probably will at some point. Like, I can take it in that way rather than going, well, I want to see a film that has 3 acts and he's going to tell me the story about spanning across time.
Yes, and I think that was the problem of this film. Is like, I mean, any movie that has 3 narratives is in trouble, right? You know, I mean, that's not generally a good. I mean, especially 3 timelines. What is that Tom Hanks sci-fi film?
Oh, Cloud Atlas.
Cloud Atlas. Yeah, that's another example of, like, you know, like, it's not bad, but that one is taking itself more serious, and this takes itself very seriously, but it's artistic and resonant.
Yes.
Whereas that one, you know, works less well.
Yeah.
What?
It's dull.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's got some ideas, but yeah, I mean, I think that The Fountain works, that you said, as poetry. I think that great cinema is able to speak to us and really make us feel and present a sort of audiovisual feast. I can't imagine this in any other medium.
No.
We'll get to that before we go. But I mean, I'm amazed at how there's a lot of plot. I would say there's a lot of plot. It's just that, like, I can't believe how compressed it is. Every scene feels amazing, and I feel like, resonant, and I'm there. I'm getting things from it.
There's a lot of plot, but it's not the point.
Yes, right.
The whole sort of story about him being the Doctor or the Conquistador or the future, there are moments, there is plot, but it's not
about.
It's not. Yeah, it's not a narrative-driven film. I mean, we talk about. We recently discussed Dune.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a plot-driven film. Like, that's a film where you're like, right, well, in this scene, these things happened, and let's talk about that. And then you have to go through it piece by piece. Yeah, this isn't that at all. This is a very different sort of experience.
Well, I mean, the Dune comparison is apt because the stuff that I like most in Dune is the non-narrative stuff. It's the shots of the desert with the rolling, beautiful photography, cinematography, and sound design, and just these shots that convey a feeling, or a scene that conveys a feeling. I mean, this movie has taken that and gotten rid of as much else as possible and just boiled it down, cut, and I love that. I mean, I'm very down on David Lynch. David Lynch has terrible narratives, but there's always like a few scenes that are just like, this is amazing. This is so beautiful. I want that. Like, stop trying to do the narrative, which you're not good at, and just do the weird, beautiful stuff. And I think this has more narrative than that. And I think the narrative works better than that. But I think that it's hard to do that and pull it off. I mean, I would say this succeeds, but it certainly succeeds a lot more than it fails.
I would say so. Yeah. No, if I was to fall on that, I would definitely say this has more. I came away with a positive experience. Yes, I refer to the final 5-10 minutes as waffly bollocks, but the other 1 hour 25 works brilliantly and is stunning in some cases, like absolutely beautifully filmed. You say about the cinematography. One of the things I would say is, like, we said about set design and costuming and that sort of thing. One of the things I do want to shout out as well is obviously the third act is clearly all CGI, like the in the bubble and all this sort of thing. But when they're traveling through the nebula, and the way it's sort of the surrounding, the way that sort of like it's lit, and it's like the CGI in this is stunning. It's really well done. It's excellent. I really enjoy looking at those things. It's not cheap.
So this leads into my next point. But you said you don't know what else to say. Okay, I'll give you the final topic, which is what you can do on a shoestring budget. And you and I often talk about how, I'm horrified by, like, $200 million to make a movie represents a failure of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Not that we don't spend $200 million on a freaking fighter jet. That's a much bigger failure. But, you and I like, I mean, if you spend that money, fine, but I want to see it on screen. The original idea for The Fountain was going to be a big budget movie, and Aronofsky couldn't get it made. And they produced a graphic novel for Vertigo, which was sort of like, this is this failed project that was my fascination, and it's turned into a graphic novel. And then he figured out how to sort of strip it down and make it cheaper, including Hugh Jackman. The budget of this is $35 million.
Wow.
$35 million. And for all of these $100 million movies that look half as good as this, go F yourself, okay?
Yes.
You can make brilliant, stunning movies on $35 million is more money than you and I will ever see in our life. It is a shocking amount of money. And this was made for that. So you said CGI. None of that is CGI.
Oh wow, how's it done?
It's all macro photography of fluids, like they did in the 60s.
Oh,
That
I love
nebula
that.
is all like fluids in a petri dish shot, like, and it looks amazing. It looks so much better than the crap CGI we get in so many movies. And you don't see like the Star Trek starfields moving, like, I mean, it looks so good. It looks so amazing. And it was all made, they used as little CGI as possible. So all of those space stuff is done with fluids, old school style, just with better cameras, man. Like,
Yeah.
Isn't that
And
awesome?
I love that. Knowing that makes it all the better. I'd love to see this graphic novel as well. I may have to track that down. But yeah, I love knowing that practical effects always impress me. And so knowing that is actually like that, like you say, that thing of like, fluids in water, and sort of they pump gas into them to get different things. I love all that stuff. I find that fascinating. So that's really cool. So again, like, yeah, watching this film, and again, there's not, the space bit, or even the Conquistador. Like, I like the fact one of the things I did notice, and I said about the set design, it's all closed sets. They're very small sets. So it's clear that they're trying to sort of like, this one's 4 foot by 5 foot kind of thing. Like, we'll keep it at that. But it works, and it's fine, and I never question it. I don't need to question it. So yeah, no, that's really impressive. 35 million is actually like seriously good. I'm assuming it didn't make its budget back because it's
No, it made like 11, 12 million back. I mean, it's a total failure. But I mean, like, clearly, like, those flowers coming up, which look great from the Conquistador, that's got to be CGI. But I mean, the one thing that always has bothered me is the shot. Although I love, like, I'm a huge fan of God, I want to say Lair of the White Worm, which I'm a huge fan of too, but of From Dusk Till Dawn. And I love the sort of like Mayan temple, and I mean, those motifs are amazing. But the distance shot of the Tree of Life behind the little facade of the Mayan temple has always bothered me.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that visually bothers me in this movie is like, really, you couldn't see that from afar.
Well,
and like,
this is
how big is this? The temple, the top of it is entirely devoted to like this little garden with a. But it still looks cool.
It does. I was going to say, yeah. There was a part of me that questioned it because of that, for that very, very reason. Because it has a door that you have to pass through. Mm-hmm. And now you're telling me it's all fiction and it's got this mystical element. There was a part of me that's like, is the start of the door and the end of the door in the same place?
Yeah.
Is it a different? Is he literally traveled into a different? Is it like, I don't know, dimension, whatever? Like, there was a part of me that was like, I can accept it on that basis because it's already got this fantasy element to it. But yeah, no, I think it's great. You say about the flowers coming out of him when he drinks the sap from the Tree of Life. It was an interesting thing of like the way it's done was very PG. And there was a part of me that's like, other directors, and this is my thought, I'd have gone full body horror. Sort of like, and it sort of has there's one flash moment that I would say would be sort of considered body horror, is when he finally sort of is succumb and you see the plants come from his eyes and mouth.
Yes.
And I'm like, that bit's shocking, but I'd have been like, I don't know, I'm going all the way. Like, I'm going to have him splitting open and I'm going to do like all kinds of like weird shit. But then watching it, I'm like, it's not about that. This is not that film. This is about something else. So I was fine with the way they did it, but there was my little sick brain was like, oh man, I'd have had him split in two and all kinds of stuff.
I love the shot though from overhead. You're right. Yeah, I love the shot from overhead where it's like the flowers vaguely in the shape of a body. The only thing I would add to that is that the same thing that you don't like of that scene that you don't like of the Inquisition with the flagellation and then the confessed
upside down
people falling. I found myself thinking like, you pull in on the flagellation Mel Gibson style, but the people falling you don't show, and it's weird. This is Darren Aronofsky, who had already done Requiem for a Dream. Like, I wouldn't think he would shy away from that kind of stuff, but maybe it was to save money or.
It felt like, because the way it was done, that instant sort of change into fast felt like a money moment. This is easier to do at this shot. One thing I was curious about, that the Tree of Life, it's the fauna. Like, if it kills him, it's not of life, is it? Like, it's just fauna. It's just flora. Like, it only helps plant life. Which I thought was interesting. Like, it's not there to help.
It does heal the cut, right?
Yeah, but then he becomes a bush.
Well, I mean, I think, so it kind of it becomes a bush. But then, I was thinking, watching that, how, I mean, I know what's going to happen, but how, I've been reading a lot about, and thinking a lot about microbiomes, and, how the second brain, and how, there's a mushroom that, can control an ant, make a zombie ant, we think we're in control, and our ideas of consciousness and whatever. So I kind of like the idea that, the Tree of Life, it gives you life, but it also, makes all of these, bacteria in your gut, grow and evolve too. It gives them life. And, all these, partially digested seeds in you, come back to life and grow into trees and shit. That's crazy.
Yeah, no, that's more horrifying. Yeah, no, but you're right. But that I did kind of like that. Like you say, when it sort of pans out and there's a vague shrubbery in the shape of a person, the Knights of Ni would be very impressed. It's good. So I think we are sort of there. So let's just get into final thoughts.
I just looked it up, and the guy who did all that macro photography with fluid dynamics and stuff, all those shots of the nebula and all those space shots, he generated all of that for $140,000 instead of millions of dollars for some dumb. You and I have watched 100 movies that were $200 million or more, where we just watched a climax, and we're watching $20 million being spent on something we don't give a shit about.
Yeah.
This guy did that for 140.
Oh man, that's impressive. Yeah. Give him all the films.
Yeah, exactly. Let's cut the budgets.
Yeah.
We're in post-COVID, right? People can't go to movie theaters anymore. Let's cut all the budgets and get people to figure out creative solutions.
I'll tell you what, even if I want to film, even if it's just your opening credits, I want some of that, doing some stuff, because it's really cool. And we're 15 years on from this now, so 15, 16 years on. So let's see what we can do now, with those. I want to see more of that. So Julian, so final thoughts on The Fountain.
I love this movie. And this movie gets better and better the more time goes on. We reviewed movies where it's interesting how our opinions change over time. And maybe it's because I know the first time my logical brain screwed with me, and I'm like, the Inquisition wasn't really like this. Yeah, you're getting this history wrong. Okay, whatever. Movies get that stuff wrong. All those, and you pointed out legitimate things. Maybe the best point is about how dangerous this idea of Hollywood idea of love and, mourning could be. However, maybe it's getting older. Maybe it's knowing what this film is, but I am just, open myself to it and go on this allegorical ride. I think it looks amazing. I think, scene by scene, I don't know what movie affects me more. Per minute by minute, I have more of an emotional, aesthetic reaction. To me, that's sublime.
Yeah. No, I have to think. I think I have to sort of reframe this film. because I went in completely cold, with a little bit of like, you know, probably preconception like of what it was going to be, and I really thought this was going to be a reincarnation story. And that was interesting. I was going, okay, it's going to be this idea, and you know, that's where the conversation is going to go. And so, but then watching the film, I'm like, oh no, this film's different. And I was digging it. Like, I'm like, okay, what is this? And it sort of reveals information, and you put the pieces together as you go. And as I said, there are subtle hints in the background of, you know, the different scenes and how things are shown, of like what's going to happen next. And all of that is really well done. And I was enjoying it. And there's some great stuff in it, you know, like you say. The visuals are just stunning. Like, you know, there are scenes in this where, like, the score as well. So we haven't talked about the score. Like we said, the music in this film is absolutely fantastic. Like, it's superb, and it really is. It really works. It's a really effective score. It's not overplayed. It's not overblown. It's just, you know. But there are moments towards, especially in that future part, with the way it's sort of set up, that it works spot on. Like, it's like that moment of, like, you know, the visuals and the music and everything's working in simpatico, and it works brilliantly. Unfortunately, there are also moments where I'm like, I'm grinning or smirking at it, or I think this feels like waffly bollocks. Like, it's just that thing that's gone too far one way, that I'm struggling to keep this within the frame of what I'd already watched. But like you say, this film isn't, weirdly, considering it's a book, you know, your idea, this idea of an adaptation of a book, it's not prose. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not prose. Mm-hmm. This is poetry. This is visual poetry, and I can see why it failed. Like, this is one of those films where mainstream audiences or mainstream critics sort of rock up to this and they're like, what? Why is Wolverine bold? Like, what's going on? I don't understand what this film is about. I thought I was getting some sort of medical thriller or something else. Like, it's not that. And you know, I can see why it fell off the board. But it is a film to be experienced. And, you know, it's one of those, I'm glad I watched it, but I think if I was to rewatch it with time, come back and watch it again, I think I'd probably have a different reaction to it. But you're right. I also think this film reacts to this film dependent on where you are with your life experience. You know, if you're young and, you know, you think you're immortal and, you know, you don't worry about those long-term thoughts of you know, your own mortality or those around you, you know, you haven't lost anyone at that point, whatever. Like, this film probably doesn't play in the same way as someone who's had loss, some life experiences and whatever, plays different to those. So which again feels like poetry. When you write, you know, you can read a poem or you can read some you know, some words, and they'll mean one thing to you at 25 and one thing to you at 45. So I feel that this film fits into that category. It's an interesting one. When we get back to we're going to get to our season review in the next show, and I'm wondering where this will fit in that idea.
I know I've thought of this, and I know my answers.
Yeah, but I'm really gonna have to consider it, because, you know, there's been some really great films we've watched, but this film feels different to some of those.
Well, it might be hard to compare because it is that sort of poetry. And I know that, I think you're right about that. I mean, we're sort of conditioned. You and I like sort of like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the sort of, you know, like, oh, every piece is important and it's all part of this master, deftly woven, logical narrative. And we're trained, especially in the West, right, to enjoy that. And we're suspicious of these dumb twists in movies and these dumb moments where it's like, yeah, I know you thought that was cool, but that doesn't make any sense. But those movies sort of, you know, inhabit that realistic world until they decide not to, because they just wanted whatever. I find that, you know, for especially film, I love, you know, because I love the sort of like music video. I love the audio-visual feast.
Mm.
And if you give me that, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like Valerian. Is it's crazy. It has these crazy moments. Narratively, it still wants to be a logical movie, kind of like an episodic logical movie, and it cannot. Like, it would be better just like let go of it, make a little bit of sense, give the structure of a narrative, but just embrace the audio-visual thing. But then, as you say, we're not trained to. I mean, we're not trained to go see it, and it would probably be a failure then. And I think this is a kind of much more mystical, poetic movie than it is a logical narrative trap.
Yeah, and I think we get these. We are more we are trained, or we are more used to, or you and I in particular, actually, not you and I, but the people of our sort of like pop culture references are probably more attuned to these, because we are used to reading novels or comics in particular that have this, or even animated films and stuff that are going to go on these journeys. Like I can use Grant Morrison or Alan Moore or whatever, those sorts of ideas. You can use those things. I mean, I don't know if it's Journey into the Fire, isn't it?
Voice of the Fire.
Voice of the Fire. So Alan Moore's book, that idea, or Jerusalem. And then with Grant Morrison, those things of like the Invisibles and his idea for the Doom Patrol. Like, you read those and you go, oh yeah, this has got some ideas in that's going to be wacky, but like they present them in different ways. But you go, okay, this has got some sort of like meta narrative, and they're using the media in a different way. Like we're sort of like used to expecting that, so we can go, oh yeah, we get that, the normal, but then we're going to get this side view. Film doesn't get to have that often, because there's this main category where everyone's like, this is what films are, this is what films are, this is what films are, and you then get something different like The Fountain, and people are like, no, that doesn't work. And I often think TV is probably the one, but like long form shows, again, you are more willing to accept this weirdness, or these narrative structures, or these narrative traps, or whatever, or these narrative experiments. And so I think again of TV shows where they're going like, oh well, this episode we're going to have a completely we're going to go off and do this for this episode and do whatever, but it's still all part of the giant narrative. And so I wonder sometimes, I watch this and I'm like, I wonder if this had been in this day, in the 2020s, would this be a HBO Max series? And it would be gangbusters. This would be awards all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly ambitious. I do feel that, but I also feel like, I wanted to say something about Grant Morrison, that I feel like Grant gets pigeonholed into like, people think that's what these plots are about, right? It's like, oh, the metafictional conceit. Most of his stuff doesn't have any metafiction in it. Oh
no, he just ignore. Yes,
but but my point is like, when I've talked to Grant, I mean, I'm not his buddy, but I wish I were. But when I have talked to him, he seems so much more focused on, like, I mean, he loved The Dark Knight, and I was like, you want Batman to be silly, you're not into the realistic superhero. And he's like, yeah, but it's so good. Yeah. I mean, I think that we can judge individual works based on, art for art's sake, based on what they want to be. And I think that Grant seems much more interested in, like, what did you get out of it? Like, did that work for you? If it worked for you, that transfigured dude, like, that's awesome. If it didn't, now, oh well, it worked for that other guy. And, and so that makes me think, getting back to the point of The Fountain and this sort of mystical thing and embracing the moment and being present, our objections to movies that have these logical flaws are really just an objection to, like that sort of, I mean, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, sort of like logical, our training. all those rules can be violated.
Oh yeah.
But movies and narratives signal that they're in that logical world in certain ways, and then have to be judged by it. And so they don't get to introduce like, well, I've got a magic wand that makes us reverse time.
Yeah.
You don't get to introduce that. This movie doesn't exist in that world. And in the end, it's all just poetry anyway. It's all audiovisual poetry that we make sense of. And at best, it signals to us what kind of world, what kind of sense it's asking us to make, if any of that makes sense.
No, I agree. I do agree. And I think you've got to be willing to take it on that. You've got to be willing to take it on that premise, on its own sort of merits. And I think I sometimes struggle with that because, the film also presents a sort of a relatively straightforward narrative, and you're like, okay, well, which one are you going with, sort of thing. As you said, sort of tonally, sometimes it sort of slips, but overall,
you don't know as you're watching it the first time. You don't know, like, what rules do you want me to judge you by?
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking about when I put this against the other films that we've watched this season. I think there's going to be that question of like, where does it fit? Because can I compare this to, Star Trek: The Motion Picture? Can I compare this? The one I would say that I can compare this most closely to would be The Man Who Fell to Earth. In that falls in that same sort of like, the visual bucket where you're like, there's moments where you're like, I ain't got a clue what's going on. Was that Pilgrim family really there? Is it what happened? I have no idea. I still don't understand that scene. I love it. I enjoy that whole film. I think about that film a lot, at times. And so yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to make this, as I sort of like let all this gestate in my head, and I'm going to rank that order. I think we'll have to see, really. Anyway,
well, tune in next time to listen to how the hell we figure out 12 movies and sort of rank them side by side and argue and figure through this.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm looking forward to the conversation. But that's what's coming next, ladies and gentlemen. On the next episode, it's our sort of season review of those 12 films. But more than that, we'll be giving you up some more stuff. I'm going to give a bit of a layout now, really, I suppose, because you should know, I suppose in the last sort of 3, there's been a couple of films we've gone quite deep, and I think we've had some fantastic conversations. I think we've really sort of nailed a lot of stuff recently, and become quite sort of, we've given a lot of ourselves, and I think that's great because that's what we're sort of, these conversations are for. But we are going to be talking about some crazy dumb shit as well at some point in the future. Don't worry. Following the season in review, we're going into our special, our between season specials, and this time we've got a bit of a double header. We're going to be doing some Terry Gilliam. We're going to be covering off 4 films. 3 of the reviews are sort of like I'm going to say retreads. We sort of had those ready from previous recordings from 20th Century Geek, so we're going to re-release those, and that's for Time Bandits, Baron Munchausen, and Brazil. But we're also going to include 12 Monkeys in that as well. So we're going to be talking about 12 Monkeys, which is a great film. So we'll be talking about that. And then beyond that, we're going to be stepping into the TARDIS. And we are going to be doing a run on classic Doctor Who. None of this newfangled stuff, eh? None of your Russell T Davies and your David Tennants. No. We're going all the way back to the beginning. We're going to cover the original 7 classic Doctors. And we are going to take one story from each of those Doctors. We've chosen, we'll release which ones they are, we'll tell you which ones they are, and we're going to give our thoughts on classic Doctor Who stories, 1 per episode. So that's our special, and then we'll be cracking on into the next season, and we'll release all that information in the future. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. And ladies and gentlemen,
ambitious. We got ambitious plans here. Yeah.
We've planned out for a long time. We've had to show it to Till. Tilleran has had a look at the plans. He's given us the nod, the rubber stamp, and all those sorts of things.
We haven't mentioned him on the. We've mentioned him on the Patreon exclusives. If you love this show, you can subscribe to Patreon and get, extras, bonuses, including us talking about the Twilight Zone. So we've broached the subject that we now have an alien overseer on that series, but this is the first time we're mentioning. Oh yeah, by the way, we have been contacted by extraterrestrial life that has traveled here through the television airwaves, and is now in charge of our show.
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience talking with Intergalactic Life. He is still
Or she.
finding his way. Yeah. I don't think. Yeah, he, she, it. He's trying to explain how it works. One day we'll get to that. It's not two. There are more than two in that relationship. Tillaran has sort of introduced himself. He's on. Tillaran is on social media. Let's put it that way. And they are finding their way through different things. And I recently gave them a Christmas album to listen to, and they have tried some of the different pieces. They are watching the films alongside us as well, and so you will start to hear Tillaran's voice. Not his voice, but you will start to hear their thoughts through some reviews and other things that are coming up. But go find him. It's just at Tillaran Lem. I'll put a link in below. Actually, sort of like come follow along, find out what Tillaran thinks of us as a human species. He tried to explain We tried to explain Christmas to him. He was a little baffled.
I just want to add, apropos of this, I suddenly realized to my horror, I bet I misgendered Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison uses they pronouns. I grew up reading and writing about Grant Morrison, and so it's been a difficult transition for me, but I apologize for that. I'm sure I messed that up.
No, don't know. I did it. I did exactly the same, and I apologize too. It's not. Sometimes words come out of my mouth, and then my brain catches up a day or two later. Yeah. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And as Julian said, if you want to come find us, have a chat about this film or any of our films, or even try and have a chat with Tillaran, you can come find us at PodTimespace on Twitter. And obviously, come find us on the Patreon. That's patreon.com/20cg media. And just leave a review. I actually found out the other day we got some really great reviews sat around on the Apple sort of thing. So thank you very much for those. But ladies and gentlemen, we will see you on the next episode when we do talk about our season in review. We'll talk to you then.
I'm going to become a tree now.